Welcome to Straight Up Now Tell Me, Christian conversation that's straight without a chaser. I was perusing the net, I guess a couple of weeks ago, and I came across a Christian proverb that said that a friend loves at all times. And I think I must have read that maybe 4 or 5 times before I decided I was going to move on. But the thought stuck with me because I'm thinking, hey, is that even achievable? Is it possible? That is a tall order. And what made me think, I'm like, do we have one friend who can, pass that test? But even more importantly, can any of us pass that test? And so I found that very interesting. And like I said, the thought hung on for a while. But the real reason why I think is because, friendship in and of itself is already complicated, I would say. And why do I say that? Because the whole notion brings me back to a rap song by one of the legendary rap artists known as Houdini called Friends. And in that song, they asked the question, friends, how many of us have them? Ones that we can depend on. And the song goes on to chronicle, several things several challenges of friendship, and even ask the question, how, do we even know the meaning of the word friend? Food for thought. But then again, we fast forward to this age of social media that we find ourselves in. And rightly, whether or not we agree or not, I think we have been faced with, I'll say we've caught, flack from several number of folks about the whole notion of online friends. And I think I think what's being questioned is the authenticity of it all, the meaningfulness of it all. And the specific indictment has been that, we count likes, that we count, how many people are following us as an indicator, and that we also, take a look at how many people have subscribed to whatever channels that we put forward. And even with that, I think that the argument is being made that, those are not what I guess some would consider, great indicators. But I will say certainly straight off the top that we at Straight Up Now Tell Me, we certainly enjoy persons who are watching online, and we don't mind the likes. We'll take the likes, and we also don't mind being followed, and so that we can have great conversations here on today and every time we come on board. But I think that the question at hand is more so surrounding whether or not that on an individual level, on a one-on-one level, whether or not that, there's something more to this thing called friends. Food for thought. But what it takes me back to is, I guess, by way of example, is a movie that came out, I guess, any number of years ago that was entitled Stand By Me, that chronicled the lives of 4 young men, their friendship from age maybe like 9 or 10 all the way up through adulthood, and the things that kind of played out throughout that friendship. And I bring that up today because I would argue that in a lot of cases, a lot of our friendships have originated at times when we were school-age children. And I would say on the playground, and I think a lot of it was age-based and depending on who was on the playground with us or who was in the classroom with us. But, even if it wasn't the classroom or the playground, I think a lot of it still originated based on who was in the neighborhood, who was on the block, where we grew up. And with that, I would dare say that we have sort of had friendships grow out of that some that we may still have on today, and some may have faded. But then I would argue that some of the key friendships that we had as children are maybe the basis for some of the friends that we have on today. But with that, even as adults, I would say that there are some things, some relationships, with be it if we like to go to the bar with our bar buddies, our drinking buddies, and, even with our coworkers, and we may have, and they're, great relationships, much needed interactions at time if they're healthy interactions. And so there's nothing wrong with that. But the question I would ask is, in those, I guess, scenarios, if in fact that we count those persons truly as persons that we would pour our energy into energy into as friends, do they count as friends? Or are they just, persons that we have encountered and that we enjoy and, and provide us with an opportunity to relax and to unwind, are they friends? Food for thought. But along with that, there have certainly been, in other situations, persons that we have encountered who have certainly have come along, and they, come along for a while, and they kind of stay, as long as, I guess, the relationship is, benefiting them, the friendship is benefiting them, and they may, come and go, whatever the case. But I understand that, but we'll take that off the table for a minute and just kind of focus on the situations where we may, consider, persons that who we have encountered, as possible, friends. But with that, I say that to say that as we look at how or who we consider to be friends, I think we have to take a look at the expectations that we have or may have of friendships. And I would say that if we were to ask 100,000 different people, that we might get 100,000 different answers on what is expected of our friends. But I'll start with some examples, and one that I would like to present is actually something I think that I can, almost ensure that a friend of mine who's also my mentor for this podcast, something that he would say as a requirement, as an expectation of all his friends. And what I'll say is that unequivocally, he would say that if in order to be his friend, you would have to be good people. So, straight off the top, if you're not considered good people, a person who, is kind to people around you, who is known to have good character, and things like that, then, no, if that is the case, then, it's no deal at all. You will not be included in someone who is his friend. That's his expectation that it be there. But, there are others who I would say that you might have other expectations of their friends. So, there's persons who may just be like, hey, if you're kind, that's the only requirement that I have. And in order for you to be, for you to meet my expectation of what friendship is. But still, there are others yet who may say that, hey, I look at loyalty. Are you going to stand by me in certain situations? And if not, then, no, then it's a no-go for me as well. But yet and still, there are other indicators, expectations that we may have, that other persons may have of their friends, and such things such as maybe just availability. So they expect that, you're going to be there and be, an available option when they want to have a friend around or want to do things. And so if you are unavailable, then you may not check the box. You won't, that may be an expectation that they have as well. But then, I'll share something by way of example, because again, this varies maybe from person to person, or, certainly, maybe from group to group. But I had a dear friend. And so I think one thing that she shared with me is that if persons were not willing to share openly, to be fully transparent, and to share secrets with one another, then she did not consider them to be, her friend. And so if you're not willing to share your secrets and to trust, I guess, her with the secrets, then, then it was kind of a no-go, because that was a clear indicator or an expectation of, of someone that she would consider to be a friend. And so again, just by way of example, there are multitudes of things that people may, expectations that, we may have of other people regarding our friendship. And I would say, even to add to the list, that one thing would be the whole notion of trust. And so trust is one of those tricky things that we have to, play around with a little bit, because I think that whole notion, varies from person to person. And there's an old saying that, you never leave your girl with anyone, right? And so I used to laugh at that. But honestly, I dare say there may be some truth to it. And I think for the fellas, they may have to let us know. But it's an old saying. But then, even with that on the table and that understanding, I still would argue that there, in a lot of cases, there is an expectation of trust as it relates to other things that exist, and on people's list of things that have to be in play in order for them to really, to function as friends with someone. So all of that to say, we have certain expectations of persons who are our friends. But by the same token, that I would dare say that our friends have expectations of us, whether spoken or unspoken, and they may differ. May vary from what our expectations are as well. And I like to say, and I've said it before, and I've told friends of mine and other people that true friendship will cost us something. Be it, it'll cost us time. It could possibly cost us energy. Actually may cost us sacrifice, and maybe even forgiveness for some things. But true friendship will cost us something, and not that we can be or meet every expectation that our friends may have of us, and not that they can meet every expectation and every expectation we have of them, but we can put effort in and give best effort where it makes sense in some cases, and to really make sure and to really nurture those friendships. But the point being that we have expectations of one another and in the friendship. And there can be situations, quite frankly, where someone's expectation of us or vice versa is just outside of the range of things that we are able or even willing to do. And that those expectations can wear us down if we're not careful. So we have to be on guard for that. But, even beyond that, if there's nothing in sight, I guess along those lines, so we still, have, in order to really, I guess, take a look at friendship, we have to factor in those expectations that we have of one another. Food for thought. But, as we say, do we know what the whole the word friendship really means? And so if we go back to Houdini's question that they asked of us, do we really know what the word friend means? And I would say that most of us probably have a concept in mind, but that there are certainly some things that can impede friendship. And to just talk about those for a moment, and to those things that can really wear a friendship down or really take it off the table. And one of those things is selfishness, I would dare say. And if we find ourselves having to deal, with selfishness, or we've been charged with that, and we want to kind of move beyond that, then there are some tips that some experts have put forward, in the fact that they suggest that if we learn to be better listeners, then that's one thing that will help us, in that whole space, of trying to get beyond our own selfishness. But then there are other things that they've offered that we can certainly work on, and one of them is learning to shine the spotlight on someone else. And to not have to be, to work on not feeling that we have to be the center of everything that's going on. So if we really shine the spotlight on someone else and try to put them forward, in a group or in any setting, then that will help us as well. But then another thing is that we can certainly take time to really do things for other people, to do good deeds towards other people, and to maybe even volunteer, or we can do it one-on-one, but to really work on that is something that will help us along those lines. But other things I think they've suggested is that we really try to see ourselves in another person's shoes, and imagine us, being in the place where they are, and really, working from that angle as well is something that really would help us in that regard. And there's, other things that we can possibly work on. I think it's just learning to compromise is one that someone else has put forward, and really learning that we don't have to always have our own way. So if we are fighting the battle, if we're dealing with selfishness, and we, find that it's factoring into our friendships, then those are just some tips that, some of the experts or some persons have really put forward to help us, move beyond that, because that is certainly something that will kill a friendship. And I like to say it's like the antacid to friendship. It's probably one of the top things I would say that will wear a friendship out. and really, possibly bring it to an end quicker than anything. So again, so we have those things in mind. And so I think one other thing is that, to challenge our biases. If we find ourselves being biased in certain areas, that'll also help. But along the same lines, that of things that will hinder friendship. There's selfishness, but there's also self-centeredness, always, being focused on ourselves as well. And really, and the same thing I would say about that is really, what might help is shining the light on someone else and really realizing that we don't have to be the center. But one other, another thing that, I think has been known to really challenge our friendships is the whole notion of envy and being envious of, of persons. And so I think one expert has says is that if we want to know if we are really, dealing with envy, is that we have to take note of the fact of whether or not, someone showing up causes our skin to, to just, do what it does, right? If it just gets under our skin when we can't even pinpoint specifically anything that the person has done. And so quite possibly that's a case indicator, key indicator that we're dealing with envy. But what has been suggested in that space is that we first of all, we admit it. And then we also do, some self, I guess I don't want to say assessment, but, just really we look at ourselves and give ourselves a break. And the fact that, and to recognize that even the most successful people, have things that are going on in their lives. And even if our situation does not appear to be, what we want it to be, there are still some things that are, going on in our lives that we need to pay attention to. And the more we understand, the value that we have ourselves, the less likely we'll be to continue with envy in anyone or to really have to deal with that. But I think a key thing that has been said along those lines is that, envy is looking at someone, counting someone else's blessings. I think that's how it goes, and not our own. So envy is counting someone else's blessings and not counting our own, and not, really understanding, the value that we have without, the necessity of comparing or receiving value from comparing ourselves with someone else. So the more we know or understand the value that we have, the less, the less we have to deal with envy. And I would dare say this, that even if, in fact, we don't see ourselves as valuable in any other space, just know that we have that great value in God's eyes and in the way that He created us. So please factor that in, and then again, give yourself a break. Recognize that your value and see yourself, differently, and that will help, deal with envy. But again, so that's something that, really has been known to impede friendship. But another thing I would say is really, I would say meddling and really spending time being nosy and getting in people's business. And what I like to say is that I am a professional, right, at minding my own business. And I certainly hope I've gotten good at, helping other people, stay, out of my business unnecessarily as well. But I would say that I think that being, nosy and really meddling and inserting ourselves in someone else's, business, when there's not any major incident that's going on in their lives that requires us to try to offer anything in that space, that it is a key way of really, really damaging a friendship in any space. But also there's the whole notion of being gossipy. And I think a lot of people like to say that gossip does not hurt anybody. It's just, we're just chatting it up. But I think it has been proven that, gossip will end a friendship in an instant should the person who is the subject of the gossip find out. And it can be hurtful in that regard, hurtful to them. But even if they don't find out, I think experts have been known to tell us and relate to us that it hurts their reputation. It hurts how other people see them. And then even if we think that, we are justified in, what we're saying because there's some truth to it or, whatever the case may be. But I think that the point is that none of us know, beyond a shadow of doubt, how any person got into the situation that they're in. Of other factors, of other things that may have occurred. And so, being gossipy and about the situation is not helpful, and it's still hurtful, and it's not justified, by, whether or not we believe it's truthful or not. And so one thing that has been offered in that space, to really counteract being gossiping or someone who's, in a situation where there's gossiping going on, is that we can simply opt out. And one way that has been suggested to help us opt out is to simply, when someone says something about someone else, bring up something positive about them. And that way it's a gentle reminder that there's some good in all of us, and that, we don't want to go down the road of dealing with gossip. But another way of dealing with it, if we don't want to do that, that has been, brought to mind, is that we can simply just say that, very kindly that, we don't want to really gossip about this person. And the key word there was very kindly, because we don't have to make the person that we're talking to feel bad or any kind of way. We can simply opt out in a kind way and say, we don't want to, have this conversation, and just really, offer to change the subject about something else. But those things can be helpful. And so if we want to work, on being gossipy, then we have to be mindful that, gossip does hurt persons, and it hurts their reputation, and it could really damage a friendship should, the other person find out. And it could, really hurt, other people in around who really care about the person as well. So that is another thing that can really, injure a friendship and really, put us to the test. But I think one other thing that I'll say is that the whole notion of lifestyle can be a factor in a friendship. And what I'll say about that, and I certainly can be called on the carpet about this one, in the fact that, there are persons who are over busy, overscheduled, overstretched, so to speak. And so, and that notion will impede a friendship as it relates to being available. And I will argue in my case, though, that I am not over busy or overstretched or overscheduled, but I am just highly busy and highly scheduled and highly stretched, maybe even. But what that does to a friendship is, in my case, is that it causes me to gently nudge my friends to plan and to finalize a plan and to really stick to a plan when sometimes they don't want to. And really don't have to. It shouldn't have to. But I'm gently nudging them because I have a full, calendar of things, or a full load of things. And I'm gently nudging them like, can we please finalize the plan? Can we please, stick to the plan? And in all fairness, I say, sometimes yes, and sometimes the answer just has to be no. And then I have to learn to adjust and really to do what I can to make sure that everything lands the way it should be. But again, our being overly busy and things like that, those is still something yet that can impede a friendship. There's selfishness we talked about already. Self-centeredness can get in the way. Envy certainly is something that can get in the way. Being nosy or actually being gossipy, and really being overly busy are all things that can hinder a friendship. So, with that thought in mind, we talk about, some of the expectations that we have of our friends, and even some of the expectations they may have of us, and some of the things that challenge friendship and what the word friend really means. But the key thing that's on the table on today is whether or not we can meet the expectation of a friend that loves at all times. And what I will say in response to that, is it possible that we can, love our friends at all times? And I would say, absolutely. And I have come to the conclusion that it is certainly possible for us to love our friends at all times, but in order to do so, we have to really know what love really is. And with that thought in mind, I'll say that a lot of us have certainly learned, what love is from listening to some of the great, musicians of the day. The great love songs, produced by Motown, years ago, and some great love songs that have, come into place since then. And so we have, defined what love is by listening to, the great lyrics that have come from there. And there are other persons who may have learned what love is from watching, love played out in the cinema, or, on television, or, at the theater, whatever the case. And so we have learned what love is from watching, things on screen, love stories on screen and things of that nature. But, maybe still, there's still others who have learned, what love is from watching people around them, who have, what we say have fallen in love. But in order to love our friends at all times, what I will say is that we have to know what love is based on the one, who created love. And so in order to successfully love our friends at all times, we have to know what God says love is. And so what that is that love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not rude. It is not, envious. It is not, self-seeking. And so in that regard, and, does not seek its own self to really put itself, I guess in front of everything that's going on. And love is not, resentful, and it's being, refusing to be resentful. It is not being irritable or easily angered. And so those are things that we have to keep in mind based on, what God has said love really is. And so God has set an example of what love is for us. And so even when friendships go left, one of the things, that God says to love is that we don't, it does not rejoice when something wrong happens in somebody else's life, right? So we don't do that. And that, the love, actually seeks to trust first and foremost, before, going in any other direction, so to speak. And if we keep that in mind, so even if our friendships, go awry per se, and we may not still be friends on a day-to-day basis, and in our daily interactions, however that may play out, it is still possible, I would say, for us to love and to be patient with the persons, to not be rude, to be kind to them, to not be easily angered, to not be resentful even in that situation. So I would say that, and I would have to agree with God, that there is certainly, a possibility for us to love our friends at all times. And so I agree with the proverb that's, is found in the Christian proverb, in that, even in times when we find it difficult to love and to not be rude or to things like that, if we would allow God to help us, then we can still make it across the line and to really love at all times. So food for thought, and truly, really a good principle to live by, and to a good understanding to have, that we can certainly love our friends at all times. Certainly possible. And certainly should be a goal in mind. But with that thought, I just wanted to say thank you again for joining us at Straight Up Now Tell Me, and where we have great Christian conversation on a number of topics that may not be approached in other places, and where we can really just, have things to ponder in order to make life better for ourselves and our life better for someone else, and our life better for someone else. So thank you again for joining us on today, and we look forward to seeing you each and every time we meet here. You are the reason why we do what we do. So thank you again, and have a great day.